Cardinal Richelieu. Every student of European history learns the name of Louis XIII of France, and almost none of them can tell you a single decision Louis XIII made. And the reason for that specific imbalance in the historical record is that Louis XIII made almost no decisions of any consequence during his 23-year reign, because every significant decision of French domestic and foreign policy between 1624 and 1642 was made by his chief minister, and the chief minister's name was Armand Jean Duplessis, Cardinal Richelieu. And what Richelieu built during those 18 years was not simply an effective administration, but the institutional foundation of the modern French state, the centralized bureaucratic apparatus that replaced the feudal patchwork of noble privileges and regional autonomies with a unified system of royal administration. The professional diplomatic service that made France the dominant power in European international relations for the following century, and the strategic framework of reason of state that made the secular interest of the French nation the primary consideration in foreign policy over the religious allegiances that had determined European conflict for the previous century. And the specific demonstration of that last achievement was Richelieu's decision to ally Catholic France with Protestant Sweden and Protestant German princes against the Catholic Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War, a decision that subordinated religious solidarity to strategic interest in a way that shocked contemporaries and that defined the modern concept of national interest as the primary principle of foreign policy. And what Louis XIII contributed to this was his continued employment of Richelieu against the sustained pressure of the Queen Mother Marie de Medici, the Queen Anne of Austria, the king's brother Gaston, and most of the French nobility, all of whom spent years attempting to have Richelieu dismissed or destroyed. And Louis's specific contribution to French history was his repeated refusal to dismiss the minister who was actually running his kingdom, which is itself a form of political judgment, even if it was the only form Louis consistently exercised. And before you go to the next advisor on this list, if what you just heard made you want to know more, then subscribe right now, because this channel shows you who was actually holding the wheel while history looked at someone else. And there are 9 more of them, and every single one is going to reframe something you thought you already understood. Now, Bismarck. In 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and the man standing at the center of the ceremony was Kaiser Wilhelm I, and the man who had engineered every political and military step that made that ceremony possible was standing slightly behind him, and his name was Otto von Bismarck. And what Bismarck had done in the previous 9 years was use 3 carefully engineered wars against Denmark, Austria, and France to unite the German states under Prussian leadership in a way that no amount of liberal nationalist agitation had been able to achieve through peaceful political means. And the specific genius of Bismarck's method was not military, but diplomatic, because what made each war possible was not Prussian military superiority alone, but Bismarck's systematic management of the European diplomatic environment to ensure that each of Prussia's opponents fought without allies. And the isolation of Austria in 1866 and the isolation of France in 1870 were diplomatic achievements that required an understanding of European great power relationships and a willingness to make temporary alliances and break them when they had served their purpose that no other European statesman of the period possessed in equivalent measure. And after unification, Bismarck spent the next 20 years managing the European balance of power through a system of interlocking alliances whose complexity he alone fully understood, keeping France isolated, keeping Austria and Russia from going to war with each other, and keeping Germany at peace while simultaneously making it the dominant continental power. And when Wilhelm II dismissed him in 1890 and announced that he would conduct German foreign policy himself, the entire system collapsed within 20 years into the First World War, which is the most precise possible demonstration of the gap between the man who was nominally in charge and the man who was actually running things. Now, Al-Mansur of Al-Andalus. In 978 AD, the Caliph of Cordoba was a 10-year-old boy named Hisham II, and the man who actually governed the most sophisticated civilization in Western Europe was a court official named Muhammad ibn Abi Amir, who had risen through the administrative hierarchy through a combination of extraordinary administrative competence and political ruthlessness, and who took the title Al-Mansur, the Victorious, and ruled Al-Andalus for the next 26 years with a military and administrative capability that made the Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba the most powerful state in the Western Mediterranean, conducting 57 military campaigns against the Christian kingdoms of the north without losing a single one, sacking Barcelona, sacking Santiago de Compostela, and carrying its bells back to Córdoba on the shoulders of Christian prisoners, reorganizing the army, reforming the administration, and building the palace complex of Medina Azahara into one of the most magnificent centers of Islamic learning and culture in the world, all while the nominal caliph Hisham II remained in his palace with no real authority over anything, and Al-Mansur understood that the legitimacy of his power required the continued existence of the caliph whose authority he had appropriated. So he maintained Hisham in comfort and ceremony while governing entirely in his name. And when Al-Mansur died in 1002, the administrative and military system he had built collapsed within 30 years into the period of civil war called the Taifa period, that permanently ended the political unity of Muslim Iberia, which is itself the most precise demonstration of how completely one man had been the system rather than serving it. Now Empress Dowager Cixi. In 1861, the Emperor of China died and left a 6-year-old son as his heir, and a council of 8 regents to govern until the boy came of age. And within months, a coup organized by the dead emperor's 2 widows, one of whom was a 26-year-old former concubine named Cixi, had eliminated the Regency Council and established a system of co-regency in which the 2 empresses governed in the name of the child emperor. And for the next 47 years, across the reigns of 3 emperors, Cixi was the effective ruler of China, and the Western narrative that was constructed about her during her lifetime and has persisted ever since describes a corrupt and reactionary despot who blocked China's modernization and whose conservatism produced the disasters of the Boxer Rebellion and the humiliation of the foreign interventions that accompanied it. And the primary sources tell a more complicated story, because Cixi governed China during the most difficult period in its modern history, a period of internal rebellion, foreign military pressure, and the specific challenge of modernizing an ancient bureaucratic empire without destroying the institutional foundations that held it together, and the self-strengthening movement that attempted to modernize Chinese military and industrial capacity was implemented under her governance. And the 100 Days Reform of 1898 that she is credited with suppressing was, in the primary sources, a more complicated political event than the simple narrative of a reactionary empress blocking progressive reform, because the specific reform proposals included changes that would have eliminated the examination system on which the entire Chinese bureaucracy depended, and which Cixi correctly identified as politically destabilizing, regardless of their theoretical merits. And the question that historians of the late Qing period find most significant is not whether Cixi made errors of judgment, because she made many, but whether any ruler faced with the same combination of internal fragmentation and external military pressure would have produced significantly better outcomes. And if you are watching this and you have not yet liked this video, do it now, because the algorithm only promotes this kind of history when enough people tell it. The content is worth seeing. And the next advisor ran an empire for decades from behind a curtain so complete that most people today have never heard his name. Now, Sejong's scholars. In 1443, the Korean king Sejong the Great announced the creation of Hangul, the Korean alphabet that gave ordinary Koreans the ability to read and write for the first time. And Sejong is remembered as one of the greatest rulers in Korean history, and the creator of Hangul is credited to him personally. And the primary sources tell a more complicated story, because Hangul was not created by Sejong alone, but by a group of scholars called the Hall of Worthies, the Jipyeonjeon, that Sejong had established as a royal research institution. And the specific scholars who designed the phonological system of Hangul, who developed its theoretical framework based on Chinese phonological scholarship and Korean sound patterns, who wrote the Hunminjeongeum, the document explaining the alphabet's design principles, were the members of the Hall of Worthies whose individual contributions are documented in Korean historical records and whose names are almost entirely unknown outside specialist Korean historical scholarship. And what makes this case particularly significant is that we actually know the names and contributions of several of the scholars involved, including Jung In-ji, who wrote the postface to the Hunminjeongeum describing the collaborative nature of the project. And those names have been consistently subordinated to Sejongs in the historical narrative because the political and national mythology surrounding Sejong required the alphabet to be the achievement of the great king rather than the achievement of a team of scholars working under royal patronage. And the Hall of Worthies was abolished by Sejong's successor, and most of its scholars were executed in subsequent political purges, meaning that the people who actually created one of the most rationally designed writing systems in human history were killed by the institution that had employed them. Now, Thomas Cromwell. In 1530, Henry VIII of England needed to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and could not get papal approval to do so, and had no institutional mechanism for proceeding without it. And the man who solved this problem was not Henry, but a former wool merchant's son from Putney named Thomas Cromwell, who had worked his way up through the legal and administrative hierarchy of Cardinal Wolsey's household, and who understood the English legal and parliamentary system with a precision that Henry's more aristocratic advisors consistently lacked. And what Cromwell designed between 1532 and 1540 was nothing less than the English Reformation as an institutional structure. The Acts of Parliament that severed England from Rome, the Act of Supremacy that made Henry the head of the English Church, the dissolution of the monasteries that transferred approximately a quarter of English land from church to crown, and the administrative reforms that transformed the English government from a personal household operation into a bureaucratic state with professional departments and written procedures. And what Henry contributed to this was his desire for the divorce and his willingness to sign documents, and his continued employment of Cromwell against the opposition of the conservative nobility who despised him. And Henry VIII is remembered as the king who broke with Rome, and Cromwell is remembered as the minister who was executed in 1540 when he arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, and Henry found her unattractive. And the specific injustice of that historical distribution is that the institutional framework Cromwell built, the Church of England, the reformed English state, the administrative bureaucracy, outlasted both of them by centuries and was more consequential than anything Henry personally decided. Now, Nizam al-Mulk. In 1063, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan came to power, and his chief minister was a Persian administrator named Hassan ibn Ali al-Tusi, who took the title Nizam al-Mulk, Order of the Kingdom. And for the next 30 years he governed the Seljuk Empire with an administrative sophistication that made it the dominant power in the Islamic world. And what Nizam al-Mulk built was not simply an efficient administration, but an institutional infrastructure for Islamic governance that influenced every successor state in the region for the following 5 centuries, including the Nizamiya Madrasa system, a network of educational institutions funded by the state that standardized Islamic legal education across the empire and produced generations of administrators and jurists. And the specific Nizamiya Madrasa in Baghdad was the institution where al-Ghazali taught, and where the synthesis of Islamic philosophy and theology that defined Sunni orthodoxy for subsequent centuries was developed. And Nizam al-Mulk also wrote the Siyasatnama, the Book of Government, one of the most sophisticated works of political theory in medieval Islamic literature, a systematic analysis of how states should be governed based on his decades of practical administrative experience. And he was assassinated in 1092 by a member of the Hashashin, the Nizari Ismaili sect, whose founder, Hassan-i-Sabah, had personal reasons to target the most effective administrator in the Sunni world. And the Seljuk Empire never recovered its administrative coherence after his assassination, fragmenting within years into the competing successor states that defined the political landscape of the Islamic world when the Crusaders arrived. Now Mazarin. In 1643, Louis XIII died and left a 4-year-old son as King of France, and the government of the most powerful state in Europe in the hands of the Queen Regent, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, an Italian cardinal named Jules Mazarin, who had been Richelieu's protégé and who governed France for the following 18 years through the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, the negotiation of the Peace of Westphalia that established the modern European state system, the suppression of the Fronde Rebellion, and the financial and administrative consolidation of the French state that made Louis XIV's subsequent reign possible. And Mazarin is one of the least celebrated of the great European statesmen, despite his achievements being foundational to the modern world. And the specific reason for his obscurity is partly that he governed during a minority and regency, rather than in his own right, partly that his personal manner was less dramatic than Richelieu's, and partly that the king he served became Louis XIV, who was so thoroughly celebrated that the achievements of the minister who actually built the institutional foundation for that reign were absorbed into the myth of the Sun King. And Mazarin's specific contribution, the diplomatic framework of Westphalia that made sovereignty the organizing principle of international relations, is the framework within which every international relationship in the modern world still operates. And it was designed by an Italian cardinal governing France in the name of a child king. Now, Chanakya. In approximately 320 BC, the Maurya Empire was established in northern India when Chandragupta Maurya defeated the Nanda dynasty and created the first empire to unite most of the Indian subcontinent. And Chandragupta is remembered as its founder and the man who actually designed the political strategy, the military campaign, the administrative system, and the theoretical framework that made the empire possible was his advisor, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, whose Arthashastra, the treatise on statecraft, is one of the most comprehensive works of political theory produced in the ancient world, covering taxation, foreign policy, military strategy, espionage, economic administration, and the specific mechanisms of maintaining state power, with a thoroughness and a realism that has caused modern political scientists to compare it to Machiavelli. And the Arthashastra predates Machiavelli's Prince by approximately 1800 years and is, in several respects, more systematic and more comprehensive. And what Chanakya contributed to the Maurya Empire was not simply advice, but the entire conceptual framework within which Chandragupta governed, and the specific strategic achievement of identifying and supporting Chandragupta as a candidate for power when he was still a young man without resources or allies, and then providing the political and military strategy that took him from obscurity to the throne of the largest empire in Indian history, is an achievement that has no parallel in ancient political history. And Chanakya subsequently retired, and Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, became the most celebrated ruler in Indian history. And the institutional framework that made Ashoka's reign possible was designed by an advisor who died before Ashoka was born. Now, Rasputin. And the reason to end here is not because Rasputin was the most consequential advisor on this list. He was not. But because he is the most revealing case of what happens when a ruler's dependence on an advisor becomes so complete that it destroys both of them. And the historical narrative that has surrounded Rasputin for a century, the mad monk, the sexual predator, the mystical manipulator who controlled the Russian imperial family through occult means, is a narrative constructed almost entirely by the aristocratic families and political factions who hated him and who had strong political reasons to ensure that his influence over the Romanovs was remembered as sinister rather than as what the primary sources actually show it was, which was a genuine and documented ability to relieve the suffering of the Tsarevich Alexei, whose hemophilia caused episodes of acute pain that no conventional physician could address. And the specific political dynamic that gave Rasputin his influence was not mystical manipulation, but the desperate vulnerability of a mother watching her child in agony, and the documented fact that in his presence, the child's suffering diminished. And Alexandra's dependence on Rasputin was the dependence of a parent who has found the one thing that helps and will not give it up regardless of the political cost. And the specific political cost was that Rasputin's presence at court gave the aristocratic opposition to Nicholas II a visible symbol around which to organize their campaign to undermine the imperial family's credibility. And his murder in December 1916 was organized by members of the Romanov extended family and the Russian aristocracy, who believed that removing Rasputin would somehow save the dynasty. And the dynasty fell 3 months later. And what Rasputin's case demonstrates more clearly than any other advisor on this list is that the power of an advisor is always ultimately dependent on the ruler's need. And when that need is personal rather than political, the consequences are always political, regardless of how personal they feel. And if you have watched this entire video and you are still not subscribed, then I need you to subscribe right now.